We come to Ritual 9, and in the course of our adventuring, because learning is an adventure, Alfred North Whitehead once called it the adventures of ideas, but it's an adventure of discovering that our field of reality is larger than the mind, is more filled with possibilities than just nature, and so has quite an enormous range. And in this particular learning, we are sidestepping all the time the temptation to use instruction based on a mental order which would commandeer our controlling the information so that we know. It's very important to be able to know. It's very important to have a mind. It's very important to know how to think and to establish an order. But the established order is always tinged with deception. And so intelligence, unprepared, ill-cautioned, will always create its own doom. This realization was the basis of Greek tragedy, and it is also the basis of Zen. And so we're taking both Basho and Euripides. Basho, the greatest Zen haiku poet of Japan, lived about 400 years ago, and Euripides, who was the last great Greek tragedian. He wrote the Bacchae when he was exiled from Athens. They threw him out. He wrote it when he was 70, which at that time, around 406 BC, 70 was quite an old age. And so it was the last play of his life. It was the last great Greek tragedy. And it ended a career of Greek tragedy that only went for about 50 years. Now, there were moments where one would like to say that, yes, there were many other great Greek tragedians, but in antiquity, the field of the literary genre of Greek tragedy was gone over with a fine-tooth comb. And the considered conclusion were reiterated everywhere that learning in the Hellenistic age, which was colossal, Alexandria and Antioch, Ephesus, many other places, Rome. The conclusion was that there were three great Greek tragedians and one great master of comedy, Aristophanes. Now we're taking Zen traveling and Greek tragedy because they make one of the largest parenthetical sets that we can encompass in our looking at how ritual as a phase of learning occurs with a poignancy that sometimes is almost too much to bear. It's not only that Zen is East and Greek tragedy is West, or that Greek tragedy is ancient and Basho fairly recent. He died in 1694. It's that this set of Zen traveling and Greek tragedy allow us to put in a parenthetical set a ordination of civilization that would be unimaginable, unrealizable without its extent, without its range. And so we're schooling ourselves that before we can be intelligent about something, before we can think about something at all, before symbols come into play, there needs to be a phase of experience. And that phase of experience is the mythic horizon of language and feeling and images. And languaged, feeling-toned images constitute the process of experience. And that process of experience is generated by existentiality, by objective action, by karma, by doing. And our whole approach to ritual is to create a 4-part set, 4 lectures that make a square to begin, 4 presentations that make a square in the middle, and 4 presentations that make a square at the end, beginning, middle, and end. A sequence that we're all familiar with, but we add a 13th presentation, which is not in any of the sets of 4 that went before. It's not a part of the 12. It is like a 0 interval space that allows for an interphase articulation that otherwise would not occur. If we don't have a space between the words, then the letters run together and they just make a longer word. And what happens is that one comes out with a single long word that becomes increasingly nonsensical. And so for articulation, we have to have spaces. I'm old enough to have learned to set type as a boy. And when you would set type, holding the little metal flange in your one hand, and before you would be a big wooden crate of different sizes, and there would be lead letters. And there would be at the bottom a big box of blanks that would be spacers. And you would have to learn in setting type that the words are always given a spacer, so that a language in its word has built into it a space. And that space, we call it in this learning the interval in between the 12 presentations that make up a phase. And since we have 8 phases, we have 8 intervals as well. And if one were to take the entire harmonic of what is being presented, you would have 8 phases of learning and 8 intervals that are spaces outside of that learning. And those 8 and the other 8 make 16. And in the ancient Buddhist learning, in the deepest contemplative yoga of the classical historical Buddha, his refinement was enough to establish that there is such a thing as a moment of thought, an objective moment of thought. In Sanskrit, it's called Bodhichitta. There is a moment of thought, and all thought is made up of the iterations of moments of thought. But in those moments of thought, there are 16 discernible parts, so that the ancient Dharma chakra had 16 spokes, ostensibly. But it really only had 8 spokes. Because the first 8 are discrete and are separable. The first 8 parts of a moment of thought are separable, but the second half of that, the second 8 parts, are not distinguishable on any level of accuracy. They occur always together, the classic way in which I used to talk about it 40 years ago, they occur as a trill. They occur as a motion that has no distinctiveness whatsoever, so it's an invisible motion. That trill of invisible motion is equal to all of the 8 parts of a moment of thought that could be made distinct. So that a moment of thought is like a microscopic octave. It is a set of 8 that together make a form, but interspersed in that form is an equal amount of openness that doesn't register as any one of the 8 parts, but does register as a trill of openness equal to the form that is there. And so the ancient understanding of wisdom was always the process which you do not see is evident there in the articulation of the objectivity that you do see. So that our education has alternate phases of form and phases of process. The phases of process, like nature or mythic language, are like the way in which the dynamic flow as a process does not found itself on stability in form or on its ability to be defined accurately in objectivity. And we saw with nature that it simply occurs, and it occurs in a very peculiar way. It occurs with time as the first dimension. And that as time's dynamic occurs, space blossoms out of time, and it blossoms in such a way that it is able to be integrated in existence, in existentiality, into stable forms, like protons, or neutrons, or electrons, or photons, or gluons, particles, atoms, molecules. But all of these forms, the stability of these forms, the stability of existentials, is that their structure be exact and not be flawed. And if they are precisely exact, they occur in such a way that their distinctiveness does not encourage them to participate with any other forms. This is true in atomic structure. Elements. There are sets of elements. The periodic table was a stroke of genius from Mendeleev, who found that when you look at the structure of elements, their whole arrangement seems to be in sets, in families. In fact, it turns out to have 8 distinct families, where each element in these families is very similar to each other, and that the 8th family is a family of inert gases: helium, neon, argon, xenon, radon. And these inert gases are inert. They don't like to mix with other elements at all because their atomic structure, especially in the electrical net, the electron shells around them are perfectly filled. And each one of those noble gases, there are 6 of them, has all of its electron shells completely full. And therefore they do not like to mix with other elements. All the other elements have electron shells, the farthest out of whatever the structure is, are not quite filled, and so they like to merge together to make molecules. H2O. Oxygen and 2 hydrogen love to get together and make molecules of water, and they do so everywhere in the universe. water is one of the most common molecules in the universe, contrary to what people used to think in the 1950s. Almost all stable bodies, from planets on down to comets, contain water molecules. Water molecules are even there in clouds in interstellar space. So that the whole idea of existence, of existentials, forming families, forming sets, and that the sets together forming a structure of order is always the primordial cue for the way in which ritual comportment stabilizes itself essentially and objectively. Now, in our learning, we've come to see that as our species has developed, especially over the last 5,000 years, especially coming out of several different types of species before us, and our own species emerging about 160,000 years ago, but about 40,000 years ago, of achieving an ability to have a new kind of form that had never been seen before. And the form was the form of art. And that Paleolithic art, as a form, for the very first time, disclosed that there are differential forms as well as integral forms. Not just forms of existence, and later on we'll see symbolic forms of thought, both of which are very objective, have their own orders, their own structures, their own polarities, and that they occur in very similar ways everywhere that they can. But forms of art are different. They are differential forms, and when our learning gets to the second year, we'll see that the ecology of integral nature becomes changed enough that now it's a different ecology of differential consciousness. And that where our first year was about nature, ritual, myth, and symbol, the second year will be vision, art, history, science. And that those four establish a completely different ecology, a differential ecology, whose main process is to develop possibility. One might even say it exponentially, to develop possibilities of possibility. And the best thing that one could say is that in the integral, the natural integral, there is a universe, there is a one place that contains it all. But in differential consciousness, there is a cosmos that is completely open everywhere and thus boundless. And it is not only boundless in its peripheral, would-be defining boundary, but it is boundless in its center as well. And because it is boundless in the center, and in all of its boundary, would-be boundary, the zero quality of differential consciousness is equally distributed throughout all of the forms of nature as well. So that nature really has hidden, invisible opennesses everywhere. And if one were to really look at the universe with very large, comprehensive, meditational eyes, one would see that the material universe is akin to a kind of a foam, a cosmic foam, rather than static, hard things like the facts that Charles Dickens' novel used to say. The grad grind would pound the table and say, I just want facts. I want instruction, I want things clear. We have to be practical in this world. Being practical in this universe means learning to have a foamed openness distributed everywhere, and to carry the realization that at whatever would be the center is not a dot, but is always a transform capacity. And that the bounds are not boundaries, but they're boundless, especially in the sense that if one were to give a word in English, where does it go from there? It goes into eternity. The word originated 5,000 years ago at the beginnings of Egyptian civilization. The word in Egyptian actually is the unpronounceable openness. And its phonetic designation, when Sir Wallace Budge was doing his great hieroglyphic dictionary, he gave it the English phonetic NTR, and usually it's pronounced in early Egyptology as Natur. But if you pronounce it without the vowels that are thrown into it, it's pronounced Ntr. It is a word like Om that contains all of the sounds which we would be capable of in the entire range of our language, of our linguistic expression, of the sounds that we could make. And this is extremely important, for instance, in the Zohar, where one is looking to see the name of the Savior of the cosmos, the Messiah of Messiahs. That name has 4 Hebrew letters grouped in a pair of pairs, and in the middle of those is an openness, which is only an, as they say in linguistics, an aspirant. So it is not pronounced, but it is a minute pause that allows for the 4-letter name to be said as a pair of pairs rather than as a square. And when you have a pair of pairs instead of a square, you now have a different form. A square is a very solid base in the universe, but a pair of pairs is a tuning fork in the cosmos, is a completely different readout. So we're trying to educate ourselves. We're trying to learn how to learn. And in doing so, we have to be not only prepared, we have to be prepared to be prepared. And so ritual must be looked at before we can go to experience, to myth, and myth before we can go to symbol, and symbol before we can go to the magical transforms of visionary consciousness. And we're coming now to Ritual 9 today. And we're trying to look at this very large set of Zen travel in Basho. I'm choosing his great work, the Oko no Hosomichi, translated sometimes as the narrow road to the deep north, or sometimes back roads to far towns. It literally means going to the farthest end, but in Zen, the farthest end is a complete openness. And so Basho is taking himself as a traveler to exhaust the structure of landscape and events and episodes of this world and to go beyond it into the beyond. In early Buddhism, before it was chopped up into Mahayana and Hinayana, or Mahayana and Theravada, the historical Buddha used to call this the Parayana. It's the way beyond. And the way beyond is the esoteric beginnings of Zen, back with the historical Buddha, about 2,500 years ago. And we'll see that when Basho begins his narrow road to the deep north, I've got a couple of different translations here. This one is Sam Hamill, Narrow Road to the Interior. He prefers that the interior space is metaphoric of that vast interior, the interior of Japan, that Basho lived in Edo, which is today Tokyo, on the Sumida River, very big river there, and that he lived in a little hut, and it was called the Basho An. And the reason it was called the Basho An is that Basho, in Japanese, Basho means banana plant. And he used to have a very fond banana plant who was his friend. In Asia, the man is not a descendant of animals. In the Asian tradition, going back, the earliest record of it is the Chandogya Upanishad, about 750 BC. And in the Chandogya Upanishad, the declension is that man is the essence of plant. Plants are the essence of life. Man is the essence of plant. Speech is the essence of man, in Sanskrit called vak. And om is the essence of speech. So that the descent of species takes man from plants. And so Basho, being extraordinarily refined, as refined a human being as has ever lived on this planet, his best friend was this banana plant that he raised, and it got big enough that friends of his were able to take shoots off of it and put it in their own gardens, and pretty soon everybody just called him Basho, because that was how he was not identified, but he was looked to, because the banana plant has very large fronds that break quite easily, they tear in the wind quite easily, and yet it continues to live, continues to exist, and to bear fruit. And so Basho took that as his poetic name. And where he was in Old Edo on the Sumida River in the Basho An, there were two great highways that went south. One of them was along the coast, went all the way down to the old capital, Kyoto. From Edo, Tokyo, down to Kyoto by the coast, and it was called the Tokaido. Later on, Hiroshige would do a series of 55 prints of the stages of the Tokaido. 53 stages plus a beginning and an end, which were not counted in the set. They were the articulate bounds of zero. The beginning of the Tokaido was always the great, huge bridge. There were several of them over the Sumida River, but the biggest one was a bridge from which all of the mileages in Japan were measured. Like in Rome, there was a pillar in the Roman Forum at the beginning of the Roman Forum, and that was mile 0. And every road in the Roman Empire bore a number of miles of how far it was from that pillar. And whether you went by the Appian Way or the Flaminia Way, wherever you went in the Roman world, you always knew how many miles, Roman miles, exactly you were from that place in the Roman Forum, which was in front of the temple of the godhood of the Roman emperor. Later on, when Vespasian got rid of the Caesar line and brought in his own Flavian line of emperors, he was very superstitious that somehow they had not put a mysterious messianic element into the magic of the Roman Empire, and he considered himself the Messiah. And so the Emperor Vespasian redid that whole part of the Roman Forum so that the pillar would be surrounded by a new magical architecture and structure. And later, when the Flavian line went insane, the oldest son of Vespasian turned into such a tyrant that they called it the terror of Domitian. Domitian ran up against a man who pulled the plug on the Flavian family's pretended messiahism. He had brought captive to Rome in front of him the apostle St. John. And St. John's Zen presence punctured the entire would-be magical political realm of the Roman Empire in the personage of the Flavian emperors. And Domitian, who was a natural-born killer, was too afraid to make a ghost or a god out of St. John, and so he had him exiled to an island that was shaped like a stone ship, Patmos. And there, St. John, on that stone ship island that would never go anywhere, he wrote the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, which brought the entire Roman Empire to a crisis. And of course, when Trajan came in and restored the empire, he did two things. He redid the entire Roman Forum so that it became Trajan's Roman Forum in a completely new way, and he almost never went to Rome. He spent all of his time outside of Rome so that they couldn't get him. So that the secret power of this true Messiah that people were beginning to hear about had really lived, couldn't get to him because he never went into town, and he had completely changed it. And so the Roman Empire should be fine, and all the miles and all the structure, all the order. All of this is a ritual comportment raised to the level of world control. And the first person to moot that there was such a thing possible as world control, was Cyrus the Great, who was a Persian, an Achaemenid. He was the founder of the Achaemenid dynasty. And under Cyrus the Great, he was very careful to keep expanding, to know that an empire survives by conquest, by constantly conquering new lands and blending them, feeding them into the ritual tapestry of a complex order. And so the Persian Empire spread from everywhere, from Egypt to India and into Central Asia. And the only place that they couldn't quite bring in were the Greeks. And so the Greeks and the Persians had two great standoff battles. The first one, in 490 BC, was when this massive fleet of Persian men and ships were landing on the coast of Greece behind a mountain range that's between Athens and the rest of that other river delta. They were coming with such a massive army. It was, I think that the numbers were somewhere around close to 50,000 men. And a very small troop of Greeks took their final leave of their families and life and marched nonstop over the pass of those mountains. And there, in that river delta, it's called the Plain of Marathon. They ran with full armor after marching all night, double step. They ran across the field of Marathon to sacrifice themselves completely, and somewhere around 2,000 Greeks destroyed the Persian fleet, not allowing them to land, sending them into chaos. And one of the men who was there at Marathon, one of the Greeks, was Aeschylus, who was the founder of Greek tragedy. And when he died 90 years later in Sicily, in Gela, his tombstone read, nothing mentioning that he was the founder of Greek tragedy and one of the greatest writers to ever have lived. He mentioned only, "Here lies Aeschylus, who fought at Marathon, and whom the long-haired Persians will still tell you of their courage." The Greeks, 10 years later, beat the Persians again at Salamis, an island just outside of the Piraeus harbor of Athens. And from that moment on, from 480 BC on, the Greeks began to understand that they needed to do what the Persians did, but they needed to do it in an Athenian way. And that is, you have to have a lot of groups of different places that band together in a strong confederacy, and that confederacy then will be able to do to the Persian Empire what the Greeks had done to them at Marathon and Salamis. And so the Athenians began building an Athenian League of all different kinds of cities and colonies and putting it together under the aegis, very, very, very similar to the United States in the 20th century, having colonies and bases everywhere in the Aegean, everywhere in the Mediterranean where Greeks went to. And sure enough, another group of Greeks said, well, we're not going to let the Athenians hog all this and have an empire. So under Sparta, a lot of littler places got together and said, now we're going to have a Spartan league. And so those two leagues, those two Greek leagues, fought each other off and on. It's called the Peloponnesian War. And its history is written by Thucydides, who was an Athenian general, until they stripped him of his rank because he lost a big battle to Brasidas, who was the great figure in the Spartan League. The Greeks at this time in Athens had a Persian vision of civilization based on a ritual weaving together of different peoples and different cultures, but in order to bring them together in the Athenian model, it wasn't to have the variety that the Persians had, but it was to have a single form, our form. You do things the Athenian way. And so Athens began expanding, and whereas Sparta never had much more than less than 10,000 people in its village, Athens became several 100,000 people. Immense at the time. And it was in Athens that Greek tragedy was born, nowhere else in the world. The Mayans never had it. There was no other place that had it, except that there was a cognate form of Greek tragedy that was developed out of Zen in Japan. And its great founding writer his name was Zyami. And so one can find a study like this, published a little while ago, The Artistry of Aeschylus and Zyami, a comparative study of Greek tragedy, and No, N-O-H sometimes, or N-O with the emphasis. It is Zen theater and Greek tragedy that are the only forms that show the tuning fork of what has happened. But one can't go directly just to no drama. One has to go beyond Zyami to Basho, because the poignancy of Greek tragedy cannot be understood just by looking at its form itself. One has to take the great Greek lyric poet Pindar, because Pindar and Aeschylus are contemporaries. And Greek lyric poetry in Pindar is born the same time that Greek tragedy is born with Aeschylus. With Zen, we have to look at Zyami and Basho together, and they form what I used to call a cascade. You can not separate them by time because they both occupy that Zen timelessness distributed throughout their entire work. Let's take a little break and we'll come back. Let's come back. We're looking at a curious way to put a parenthesis around civilization. We're taking something from the farthest east and something from the most intense west, and we're pairing them. We're making them like that tuning fork. And what we're trying to do is keep an openness of aspirant, of invisible, unsaid, yet heard sense of form. When one would look with thought to look at, say, a meditation ritual based on prana, breathing, the mind says, well, you breathe in and then you breathe out. So it has this two-part cycle, and all the time the mind is deluded because the cycle is not 2 but 4. There is a split moment when you are no longer breathing in, and there is a split, minute pause that turns around, and now you're breathing out. And you're breathing out until you get to a certain extent, and then there's another turn, and now you're breathing in. So that the cycle of breath, of prana in yoga, is always a quaternary. It's a 4-part cycle. It is the 2-turn invisible non-points that allow for speech. Were it not for that, we would not be able to make articulate sound at all, nor to be able to modulate our breath fast enough and quick enough to enunciate language. When one looks to think of just brain size, Homo neanderthal had a larger brain size than Homo sapiens by enough percentage point that they should have been quite a bit more detailed. So why is our species so successful, and why did they die out? A woman, paleontologist, looked at the whole skeleton of Neanderthal and Homo sapien and noticed, yes, they were more stocky and all of that, but the neurological difference was colossal in the thoracic region. The thoracic region of the spinal column. Homo sapiens have several times the nerves, several times the capacity for neural impulses than Homo neanderthal. And the brain itself is reconfigured. And she finally pieced it together. This part, the thoracic part of the spinal column, is what controls breathing. And it isn't that we breathe deeper than they did, but that we can have breath control about 60 times faster than Homo neanderthal. And we need that kind of breath control about 70 times per second to be able to speak a language. And that Homo neanderthal could not speak a language, could make sounds, could make utterances, probably had block verbal sound signs, but never spoke a discursive language, would never have suspected that there was something like a rhetoric, and would never have even guessed that there was something transformative of rhetoric into a poetic. And so our species is not just Homo sapiens, but Homo sapiens sapiens. We're wise about being because we are conscious about our speaking, to the extent that we are not only conscious of what we say, we are conscious in between the lines, in between the words. We are conscious of spaces that allow for articulation, for opennesses, and this is the entire range then of an expressive language, as we will see. That feeling develops as a characteristic of human experience because it factors in the articulate spacing and pacing. In ritual, the pacing is always rhythmic and tends to be cyclic, tends to be linear and sequential so that it can be woven together or braided together or arced so that it can be woven in circularity, and one can make then out of ritual sequences and arcs, one can make the bowl of our kind of existence that holds within it the fruits of culture. And so Homo sapiens sapiens, ritual comportment, is able to bridge from nature to culture through ritual weaving, through ritual fabrics, ritual braiding, through making not just sequences that establish a beginning and a middle and an end, the famous syllogism of Aristotle. It's an old ritual thing. You begin somewhere definite, you go through a sequence which is definite, and you come to the concluding portion of that sequence, and that these are all acts in the sense that they are steps. They're steps. And that the steps are not controlled in ritual so much by articulation, but by the rhythm. It is the shaman's drum. In Greek tragedy, it was the flute. And while in the primordial Greek tragedy, it was the long flute, very quickly when they got into the ritual refinement of Greek tragedy, the long flute was replaced by the double flute called the aulos. And the aulos is able to make two sounds at the same time with the same breath. So that every note in an aulos has a ratioable quality to it. And a really good flute player can vary one part or the other, or sometimes both together. And when both are varied together in such a way that they are hearably dissonant, it is enough to drive someone mad. And the pipes of Pan were an aulos played with complete chaotic dissonance so that one would go mad. Pan drives one not just mad, but to panic. Because there is no space for articulation, and the ratioing is unformable objectively in existence. And so one is completely in dis-ease all the time. I think in Arabic the word for madness, I believe, is like aziz, aziz. And when one says it, aziz, 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 it's the sound of insects buzzing. It's not words, it's not language, but it is a discontinuous, confused, chaotic sound that obviates any articulation, any kind of way to have language. And without language that is able to be articulated into words, there are no images. There's just a confused swirl, like the old French marbled paper. So that the space of the mind is never clear. It's always just a swirl of incommensurates. Whereas The mind that founds itself on articulate ritual has an experience quality where the imagery and the feeling tones, while they can be extremely complex, are always distinct enough to be further integrable. And so the mind develops its thinking space because it has an interior calmness and an interior existentiality that is articulate. One of the reasons that Greek civilization was founded on Homer is because he was the clearest, most articulate speaker in that whole part of the world, and for almost 1,000 years, unapproached in his clarity. One of the traditional wisdom reasons why is that Homer was blind. He couldn't see any longer. And when he composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, he composed out of the sense of having to remember in his mind how one saw, but he wasn't looking at the chaotic, confused, inarticulate world. He was looking to find one clear image in his mind out of his experience, founded on a ritual comportment step. And so Homer is famous for all time of being so clear that the Greeks developed a philosophic mind, a historic mind, a scientific mind, far in advance of any other people on the planet at that time. But it was so precarious because there was no basis in their culture to handle such a clarity of mind that the clear mind took to dominating the culture and to make sure that everything was really codified, very clear, and you have the beginnings of the tyranny of clear thought over experience, and that's what everyone in the world feared from the Athenians, the Athenian Greeks. These people are dangerous because what they are after is to control all of us in their way alone. And so you have the beginnings of a kind of an empire. Everyone is grist for their fodder mill to be ordered in their way. And it is clearly a superior way to everyone else, so everyone will do it this way. And so you have the beginnings that eventually flowered in Alexander the Great. The entire world will become Hellenized. There will be no more separate people because everyone will have, in a ratioed, rational proportion, a common denominator of Greek. He had all of his Greek officers marry Persian women so that their children would never be just Persian anymore. They would be part Greek. And if the whole world had a common denominator of a part of them that is Greek, he called that the ecumene. It'll be one world that there'll be different numerator cultures, but there'll be a civilized denominator that will be consistently Greek. And while Alexander the Great didn't live long enough to pull it off, it was a gleaming, tantalizing goal, and the person who next tried to bring it to pass in that way was Julius Caesar. He said the Greeks were small potatoes. Athens had about 200,000 people. Rome has 2 million. We have more legions than the entire world would have together. And by the time of Julius Caesar, Roman contacts were going not only to India, but to China. There was a Roman garrison in Vietnam. They were up into Scandinavia, even going off, exploring some of the Atlantic coasts of North America. The Roman idea was not of an ecumene, of a common denominator of blood and genes and heritage, as we would say now, but a common denominator of Roman law. Everyone will live by the rituals of Roman law. No matter where you live, you're subject to it and will be subject to it. And so a ritual comportment, fabric of encodement came to be the common denominator of most of the known world at that time, outside of China. The trigger in all this that betrays it is a Greek tragedy, because Greek tragedy is based on Homer, and in particular it's based on a book of the Iliad, book 18 of the Iliad. When you come to the Iliad, it is one of the most severe compositions in expansion poetry of all time. It is perfectly trued to a square duality that ends in an incommensuration, a juxtaposition that is a complete self-destructive. The beginning of the Iliad and the end of the Iliad form the beginning of brackets, and as one reads into the Iliad, one can read backwards from it, and it goes back exact in sets of brackets till it comes to a single pivot in the center. A single pivot fulcrum upon which the entire structure is organized. And that's the death of Patroclus. The Greeks have surrounded Troy for 10 years, and the war has gone on for 10 years because it wasn't a war to beat them, but a war to conquer all of their territories, which were extensive, and then to put the coup de grace on them at the end. But at this point in the Iliad, what is so tragic about this is the pride, the hubris of the fulcrum of the Greek power. And the fulcrum of the Greek power in the Iliad is Achilles. He's not the mastermind super general. That man is Agamemnon. He's the strategic genius of how to marshal ships from all the various parts of the Greek world that would share in the booty of conquering all the rest of the world. Agamemnon was that kind of super general. But his power was based on the fact that Achilles could not be killed in battle except he had only one part of his body that was vulnerable, and that was his heel, the heel of his right foot. Because while his father was Peleus, one of the great, huge, powerful political, economic men of that age, his mother was, they say, a sea nymph named Thetis. Means that she was a beautiful woman from the outer lands, which probably meant Thrace, that part of Greece that was Orphic and very, very ancient and mysterious witchcraft stuff. And so Thetis, who was part divine, part goddess, got a commitment from Zeus that her son would never be killed, he would be invulnerable. If he were dipped as a baby into this magical potion, and they dipped him, but they forgot that when they dipped him, they had to hold his foot, and it left Achilles' heel spot of vulnerability. And as long as that was not accessible to anyone, he could never be killed in battle. So the basis of Greek victory at Troy was assured because they had the greatest warrior of all time who could not be killed. You have the same feature in the Mahabharata. Bhishma cannot be killed unless he agrees to be killed. And as long as he is fighting in the great Mahabharata war, it doesn't matter how great a warrior Arjuna is and his brothers and how many wonderful warriors they have, they cannot beat them because they cannot kill Bhishma unless he agrees to be killed. The same with Achilles. But what happens with Achilles is that he has a wrathful pride because he has this authoritative possessiveness that I'm heroic to the extent that I am better than all men. I am close to being a god myself, and whatever I control is mine to control by divine right. And he sees that the Greeks are suffering from a pestilence. Their encampment after 9 years around the walls of Troy got rather dirty and messy, and they began to die off. And Achilles saw that what was wrong was that Agamemnon had stolen a beautiful daughter of a priest of Apollo named Chryseis. And so he went to Agamemnon, like the most powerful warrior talking to the biggest general. And he said, you must give up your main squeeze. You have to send Chryseis back to her father. He's a priest of Apollo. And Apollo himself, the god of medicine as well as other things, has it in for us as long as this man's daughter is here captive. You have to send her back. And so Agamemnon says, yes, all right, I will send Chryseis back, and I will take your main squeeze, Briseis. She is now mine. I'm not the one that's going to lose. You. And so Achilles pouts. He stays out of the battle. And the Trojans begin finding a way to slowly make more and more encroachments. And so finally, Achilles agrees that his cousin Patroclus, that he's been raised with, they've always fought together, and when they are out in the field together, they are unbeatable. Always, it's like Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. There's always a sidekick who covers your flank so that you cannot be surprised, you cannot be got at, and as long as you have that person there, then there is no way that you can be beaten. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus says to his son, 21-year-old Telemachus, and the old faithful servant, that there are 115 suitors and that we're going to fight them. And the son says, well, we can't fight them. There are only 3 of us. There are 115 of them. And Odysseus says, I came back just in time, son. We will have an ally who will make us invincible. Pallas Athena will be on my side, at my side. We will win. And of course, it carries through. And it kills all 115 of them. The same would have been there with Achilles. He loans his armor to Patroclus so it can look like he's out in the field and the Trojans will cower back and they'll even things out. But the great Trojan hero Hector is not afraid of Achilles because he sees that he's not fighting up to Achilles' par. He's having a bad day, obviously. And so he kills Patroclus. He rams. Homer has a brutal way. He says the bronze steel blade went into the mouth so deep that as soon as the teeth clenched on it, the point of the bronze shattered the skull in the back. And so Hector, thinking that he's killed Achilles, mutilates the body and is in the act of mutilating it, and is to leave it on the field, mutilated, would tear your heroes up. And in book 18 of the Iliad, the news comes to Achilles that his beloved cousin, sidekick, has been killed and mutilated, and he rushes out in his chariot with no armor, almost naked. And he rushes out in such a wrath, and he's like the specter on the field. And he gathers up the mutilated body of Patroclus and brings it back, draped over his chariot front. And his mother goes to Zeus and says, "Why are you letting my son suffer this humility?" And Zeus says, "I will no longer protect the Trojans, and I will instruct Hephaestus to make new armor for Achilles, especially a super shield. And this super shield will protect him from every assailant." And so it is the shield of Achilles that is the founding of Greek tragedy. Because on the shield, in 5 bands, Hephaestus, Vulcan, the god who makes metallurgy happen, the first alchemical Greek god, and he makes this impenetrable shield, and it's described here in part. First fashioned a shield great and sturdy, adorning it cunningly in every part, and round about it set a bright rim, threefold and glittering, and thereby made fast a silver baldric. 5 were the layers of the shield itself, and on it he wrought many curious devices with cunning skill. And so this shield of Achilles will protect his invulnerability. One of the layers has a lord surveying his lands that he controls, he owns, he has this. And he's pride of all of this. I control this, my land, my landscape, it's mine. Therein he set soft, fallow land, rich, tilled, and wide, that was 3 times plowed, and plowers, full many therein, were wheeling their yokes and driving them this way and that. And whenever they would come to the headland of the field, there a man would come forth to each and give unto the plowmen honey sweet wine. So when they would finish plowing these long furrows, they'd get a drink. So they're anxious to go back, plow some more, get another drink. And so this well-plowed earth, the field plowed, grew black behind, black with fertility. But it's also the blackness of the beginning of an alchemical process. Black behind, and seemed verily as if it had been plowed, for all that it was also of gold. Herein was the great marvel of the work. Even though the plowed field would be black, on the shield in the metal it was of gold. Someone had the image of the plowed land being controlled and made fertile and powerful. Then he says, Homer a little later, therein he also set a vineyard, heavily laden with clusters of grapes. A vineyard fair and wrought of gold, black were the grapes, and the vines were set up throughout on silver poles. And around he drove a trench of Cyanus, and about that offense of 10, and one single path led thereto, whereby the vintners went and came, whensoever they gathered the vintage. And maidens and youths in childish glee were bearing the honey-sweet fruit in wicker baskets. And in their midst a boy made pleasant music with a clear-toned lyre, and sang sweetly the Linos song, with his delicate voice, and his fellows beating the earth in unison therewith, following on with bounding feet mid dance and shoutings. And here is the picture of the power to control the land of existence beautifully, bountifully, and it's on the shield that is impenetrable to anyone, and yet Achilles will be killed. There's a tragic, hidden denouement right in the center of all the concentric rings of the target that promise authority, control, power, invincibility, everything that one would expect, that now we are not only safe, but we're in control of it all, and we have every right to just extend our control, and by right of conquest, eventually, whatever we want will belong to us. We'll just simply take it. At the center of that, like an Achilles heel, is a weak point because the form is not complete. There is no center. It's open, and that's the Achilles heel. That empire power makes no provision whatsoever for the magical transform openness of possibility. It's invisible. You can't count it. It's a zero. And it's that zero at the center of that target of authority that makes the entire structure of it vulnerable, not just to being crumpled, but to be evaporated. Because reality evaporates those forms of existence that are not true. They no longer don't just hold an existence, but they are gone. They are scrambled into confusion and chaos, and then they are just wisps of fantasies and phantasms. Nothing left. In fact, the origins of speech in yogic India go back in its large poetic to Valmiki. His name meant white anthill. And he would meditate so long in the forests, so deeply, that the white ants would build their anthill over him. And he would be the invisible yogic fulcrum of the forest, not the master of the forest, but the place in which the openness of the forest had conscious openness and the ability to speak. And he was listening to a bird in the forest of freedom sing beautifully, and a hunter came and shot the bird and killed it, and without even thinking, Valmiki put a curse on the man, and of course, being so powerful a yogi, the man was like a wisp of black soot for a moment and then vanished from existence. And Valmiki began to meditate on what had happened, what it was that he had said, and the form of what he had said, and became the basis of the Sanskrit poetic form, the sloka. And not only is the Ramayana written in the sloka, and the Mahabharata, but the Vedas, the Upanishads, all the philosophy, the entirety of Sanskrit literature is written in the sloka. The sloka is two lines that are capable of put together with two other lines to make like a quatrain. It's like ancient Hebrew poetry. Always the second line is a modification of the one just before it. And when you have two in a row like that, the modifications do like an S-curve. So the origin of the poetic quatrain, the four, is that it is not just four as a square, but it's a pair of pairs that allow for a complex kind of rationing and ratioing so that one gets then, I used to call it ratios of the real. What cannot be said, nevertheless, is real because it is brought into formal arrangement where the unspeakable is a part of the articulation of its structure. And this is what you find in Basho. Perhaps as good as any poet has ever done in the world, and all great poets have this. The ability to have language that not only has a meter of danceable rhythm and expressive, articulate lines that proliferate into the shape of the poem, sometimes very large, like the Iliad or the Odyssey, sometimes poignant, like some of Pindar's poems on athletic events. But in Basho, it's not that his language in the Zen travelogue is all just poetry. It is a poetic, but it has a moment where the flow of the ritual poetic stops momentarily. And before it starts again, which it will do, in between, suspended in that articulate space, he puts a haiku. And the haiku is not about itself, but it is about disclosing that something real is non-occurring and yet is present. And so the haiku is a timeless moment. It's a moment out of time. And so the travelogue is a travelogue where the prose part of it is in the landscape going ever farther to the edges of the known world. And all along the way, one is being prepared by the incidence of haiku to come to a turning point where there is pure openness before one and nothing else. And that there is no landscape there. There is no power there. There's no authority there. There's no empire there. What one comes upon is the space in between the stars, the space in between the galaxies, the space outside the expanding universe. Just pure openness, pure nothingness. Not even a forerunner of gravitational density waves is there. It is just pure empty, as one would say. And Basho, when he writes, he says, the moon and sun are eternal travelers. Even the years wander on, a lifetime adrift in a boat, or an old age leading a tired horse into the years. Every day is a journey, and the journey itself is home. More next week.